Welcome to this session of the Hudson Institute Center for the Economics of the Internet. We have a program. We're very proud to have two of the best informed and also, I would say, humorous speakers about telecommunications law with us today. Before we start with our program, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please join us in January when the Center will be hosting Commissioner Michael O'Reilly from the Federal Communications Commission. Exact date to be set. Later this week, Jeff Lee and I will be disseminating a paper on market definitions in communications markets, suggesting that the long-time prevalence of separating wireline from wireless markets may not be appropriate anymore. And tomorrow I should have a column coming out in Forbes on tying in the Kingsbury Commitment to some current instances of the government twisting the arms of the private sector. Our speakers today are Robert Crandall, who is a longtime senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and one of the foremost authorities on the economics of telecommunications markets. John Thorne is a partner at Kellogg, Huber, Hansen, Todd, Evans, and Fiegel. He is the former Deputy General Counsel of Verizon and also one of the co-authors of what I believe is probably the best book on telecommunications law, which is sitting right here.
Demonstrative exhibit.
Our program today is going to be as follows, and for our online audience, if they have questions they'd like to ask our panelists, the Twitter hashtag is, Harry, is that what for our online audience? How do they at Hudson Institute? Right. So we welcome our online audience, and Mr. Thorne will lead off with a bit of the historical and legal background about the Kingsbury Commitment, and then Mr. Crandall will follow on with some discussion about its implications for telecommunications markets.
All right. Well, thank you, Harold, and welcome everybody who's here, everybody who's online. I think Bob and I were picked for this panel because we remember Nathan Kingsbury and worked with them in our earlier careers. The title of this session is the Mythology of the Kingsbury Commitment. I thought I would talk first about the reality of it, and then Bob, you or Harold, you can talk about how it's grown in the retrospective. Over 100 years ago, at the turn of the prior century, local telephone service in the U.S. was offered by competing local telephone companies. It was a fractious bunch. I used to hang out at a place called it's on Wacker Drive, about 100 North Wacker Drive, Chicago. It's called the Chicago Telephone Company. It's a bar now. It had been a competitor to Illinois Bell. And AT&T, which had invented a good way of carrying long-distance signals, set about buying up some of the local companies and incorporating them into an AT&T Bell system. And AT&T had patents on the repeaters that made for good quality long-distance signals and leveraged their patent strength and the long-distance network that they had built so that if you could connect with the AT&T long lines, your local customers for your local competing telephone company could not make long-distance calls, and they could call to other exchanges. If you didn't reach a deal with AT&T, then you were kind of left cold, and your remnants are now, for example, the Chicago Telephone Company on North Wacker Drive. It's just a building. In the process of buying local telephone companies, AT&T ran into a problem. They were purchasing a company I think it was in Oregon. It was someplace in the Northwest. I think it was in Oregon State. And the federal government said, we're going to challenge this. And this is now the first of several major United States Department of Justice antitrust cases against the Bell system. First one was filed in 1913. There was a later one, I think, in 1949, resolved in 1956. Another one filed in 1974, resolved in 1982. If you count the more recent merger reviews where DOJ has filed complaints and reached consent arrangements, you could count up more DOJ. But the first big government antitrust case against a piece of the Bell system involved acquisition of a small company. I think it was actually in the long-distance business in Oregon. Nathan Kingsbury was a vice president at AT&T, and he saw that this government challenge was going to be important, had to be dealt with. And so he resolved to settle with the government and sent a letter. I've got copies of these. I'm not going to read from them. Maybe Bob will.
No.
Sent a letter in 1913. I think the 100th anniversary is on the 19th, December 19, 1913. Sent a letter to the government making some promises to get the government to back off so that they could solve this lawsuit. The suit had alleged that AT&T was monopolizing telephone service between Oregon and Washington and between Washington and Idaho. Those were the relevant markets accused. The Kingsbury Commitment, the letter that AT&T sent back to the government, made a series of offers of behavioral changes. The first was that AT&T would refrain going forward from buying up any more local telephone companies. Now, they'd been buying lots of companies, and so there were some in progress where they'd made offers and they'd gotten acceptances, and these were partially completed. All the ones in progress were to be submitted to the Justice Department to say yes or no to. So they would stop making new deals, but the ones in progress, they wanted to make a case to DOJ for approving some of those. The consent decree also had some remedies that were unique to the particular markets that had been accused. So to restore competition in Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho, there was a provision which those who remember the 80s and 90s will think of as equal access. If you're going to choose a long-distance company in Oregon, there was a process for customers to either select the AT&T long lines or competing long lines. This is way back 1913. And if you couldn't do it automatically, there was an operator system, but there was an equal access-like restriction. And then the decree went on to perpetually, quote, perpetually enjoin AT&T from continuing to monopolize or attempting to monopolize commerce in long distance. That's from the 1914 decree, which incorporated the Kingsbury Commitment. And the decree wisely provided for its own modification, and I'm quoting, as may from time to time be necessary in order to conform to the development of telephony, just in case things changed. So this was the end, 1913, 1914, the end of an era of acquisitions by AT&T. And you would think, well, that's such an important development, stop acquisitions by the dominant national company, that would be something that would have lasted a long time. It didn't last very long. I mean, World War I, between 1918 and 1919, the Postmaster General took over the Bell system. And like PTTs throughout the world, the U.S. Postmaster thought, well, we need a national system. And so the acquisitions started up anew, and many more things were consolidated. 1921, Congress passed a law called the Willis-Graham Act, which expressly overrode the Kingsbury Commitment, gave the Interstate Commerce Commission authority to exempt telephone mergers from the antitrust laws. And in general, throughout this period, despite the government's attempt in 1913, there was an attitude that was hostile to local telephone competition. So if you read, and the AT&T Bell system in the 1974 case assembled lots of the old editorial stories from the turn of the century. The newspapers would say that local competition was chaotic, It was a hindrance, a nuisance, wasteful duplication. The Beaumont, Texas enterprise said 2 telephones are as useless as 2 bulky horses. An 1897 editorial in the Burlington, Iowa Evening Gazette said, if there's anything in the world that would reconcile any business community to have no telephone at all, it's a few months' experience with 2 telephones. So the Kingsbury Commitment was a settlement that stopped a process of mergers, and it didn't last very long because of the various developments that that took place shortly afterward. There is something else at the same time I want to mention, Harold, if I can, that has endured. Next year will be its anniversary. It's a 1914 law, and so maybe the Hudson Institute would like to host a 100-year retrospective of it. 1914, Congress passed the Clayton Act, and the Clayton Act has a merger provision, Section 7, and I think I brought a demonstrative exhibit here. This is
here too.
This is Section 7 of the Clayton Act says that it's illegal, wrong, unlawful to have an acquisition where in any line of commerce or in any activity affecting commerce in any section of the country, the acquisition may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. That's unlawful. That's been the law in the Clayton Act since 1914. I had a transaction before the Justice Department for my former client when Bell Atlantic was merging with NYNEX, and this is all public report. I'm not telling you something secret. The staff at the Justice Department got up and was concerned about the Bell Atlantic NYNEX merger and there was a second request, and they took evidence, and they were preparing a case to block the merger of Bell Atlantic and NYNEX. And one of the people on the trial team for Bell Atlantic thought, well, maybe we should read the statute. We all know what it says. Substantially less competition tend to create a monopoly. That's what everyone had learned in law school and remembered. One smart guy said, well, I'm going to read the statute. It turns out that Clayton 7 has multiple paragraphs. It's not 2 sentences long. This is not like Sherman Act 1 and 2, which really are 1 or 2 sentences. The Clayton Act has multiple paragraphs. Paragraph 4 of Clayton 7 has a different standard for common carriers. Congress in 1914 identified special efficiencies of assembling networks. They're called line extensions in that era, where if you wanted to, you got a group of lines here and a group of lines there, and you want to merge them. There's an efficiency because now people who are served here can call people who are served here. So the concept that there would be something better if common carriers merge and combine their networks, that's embodied in the statute. There's an easier standard for merging 2 common carriers. Now, in the initial draft of the legislation, it was clear that other kinds of common carriers were going to be included, so electric utilities and pipelines and some other common carriers. When the legislation got to the House, Congressman Thorne said, wait a minute, it's really important that this lower, easier standard for common carrier mergers be extended to telephone companies. I'm reading now from a different demonstrative exhibit. This is 1914, Congressman Thorne. He writes, or he says on the floor, I happen to live in a town where we have 2 systems. One exchange is located in Texas and the other in Arkansas. And I wish to make it certain that my people will not always be compelled to patronize and maintain 2 telephone systems. I dare say there are other towns in the United States that are similarly located and that feel the same burden my town does. And he introduced an amendment saying that telephone company mergers should get an extra special lenient standard. His amendment was defeated because on the Senate side, they concluded that just making telephone companies subject to this common carrier exemption, or common carrier lower standard would be sufficient. So for almost 100 years, 99 years, the Clayton Act merger standard is, paragraph 4 is in Section 7 is different and more lenient. Now, at the time of the Bell Atlantic NYNEX merger, this had only been interpreted once in a Seventh Circuit case involving trucking companies. And the Seventh Circuit wrote that where you had 2 trucking organizations with an insubstantial overlap, some towns that were served jointly by the trucks, you were going to ignore the relatively insubstantial overlap. That was the only precedent at the time of the Bell Atlantic NYNEX merger. When SBC and Ameritech merged, there was a private challenge. There had been an accusation, or maybe people in the audience probably know this. SBC had some designs on Chicago. SBC had not served Chicago, but they had some plan or something in the documents that reflected a desire to build overlapping local service against Ameritech. In that deal, there's a private challenge, and again, the Seventh Circuit got it, and Judge Easterbrook wrote that if there's insubstantial competition that's destroyed, that's okay. We got an easier standard for common carrier mergers. Those are the two precedents I'm aware of. One Navajo Trucking, the Seventh Circuit. The other one, I think, Coalition of South Austin against SBC in the Seventh Circuit. All right, I'm not going to tell you all the other interesting legislation that bears on this, and for example, that the Federal Trade Commission Act has an exemption for common carriers. But there's an interesting theme throughout the things that have endured, not the Kingsbury Commitment, but, for example, the Clayton Act, that there's something beneficial when common carriers extend their service through merger, and that gets a lesser standard of scrutiny. So I'm going to stop there.
Great.
It's interesting to hear John recount the history. I have some of the similar notes, but I let the lawyer give us the legal history. And besides, I had to go back to my copy of this book to refresh my memory and be educated anyway, so it's appropriate that John give those examples. I think the interest in the Kingsbury Commitment today is probably based upon some notion that this was the beginning of some sort of social compact between AT&T and the government to exempt them from very aggressive antitrust enforcement in return for their submitting to regulation. And I think there is some hope that perhaps from some quarters today that we could get a similar social compact over issues like net neutrality and interconnection and so forth that would revive the regulatory environment, which of course has been greatly reduced since the Reagan administration and successive deregulations and the Telecom Act and various court decisions. What is interesting about the Kingsbury Commitment, though, was that while AT&T had to agree to interconnect its local competitors with their long-distance network, there was no requirement in there, John, was there, for local interconnection?
That's correct.
Now, I don't know what the technology of local connection was. All these local homely stories that John tells, I have a few quotes too that I won't read, about the necessity of having several telephones on your desk means that there was no interconnection, or you wouldn't have to have separate telephones. I don't know what the technology was at the time. Had electromechanical switching come in yet? Not yet, right? It was too early. So it would have required this kind of interconnection to have local interconnection, I guess. And the absence of local interconnection would make local competition very, very difficult. And in fact, by the time of that Willis-Graham Act that John mentions, which turns over merger authority to the ICC, by the time that's passed, the House report supporting that, and this is 8 years after the Kingsbury Commitment, says that there's a quote in there saying, there's nothing to be gained from local competition. So if the objective of the original Kingsbury Commitment was to promote competition among local telephone companies by giving them access to Bell's long-distance network, essentially the Congress had given up by that time. Of course, as John points out, during World War I, the government itself, when the Postmaster General ran the AT&T, ran the National Telephone Network, encouraged consolidation. The notion that public utilities always gain from economies of scale, though, I mean, that might have been true at that time. It certainly is not necessarily true today. And, I mean, the economies of scale in local operations today are very small. It's the economies of density which count in that business. But what I think a lot of the current discussion of the Kingsbury Commitment overlooks is the fact that essentially what this first step towards some sort of federal government oversight of the telephone industry, that is of mergers and consolidations and exchanges of property by telephone companies, was to be supervised by the Interstate Commerce Commission, which hardly over time became a champion of competition. And in fact, like all regulation, which is political in nature, established a system of creating rents for some groups by taxing other groups, specifically by providing rents to rural. This was the populist movement of the late 19th century. Rural customers by taxing the urban customers of the interurban facilities, something which continued all the way into 1980 after Congress passed the Motor Carrier Act, which would bring trucks under regulation in order to prevent them from competing aggressively with railroads so that railroads could keep inefficient lines in operation by forcing the customers of trucking companies and the interurban rail services to pay higher rates in order to cross-subsidize rural interests. And in fact, that philosophy continued when the regulation of communications was passed to the Federal Communications Commission in 1934, but maybe not immediately, but over time, regulation at the federal level, in cooperation with or in agreement with state regulators, turned out to be a system of you have to be careful using cross-subsidy. I don't have Jerry Fallhaber on this panel, but of using regulation to allocate more of the cost than is efficient to long-distance services so as to provide local services and particularly local rural services at very low prices. So what the homely support of the Kingsbury Commitment would have us believe is that this was a necessary step in submitting this large, potentially monopolized sector and eventually monopolized sector to regulation for the public interest, establishing universal service and so forth, ignores the fact that it was an extremely inefficient mechanism which could only be supported by keeping entrants out, keeping railroad entrants out, keeping trucking entrants out, and of course, in the later stages of FCC regulation, keeping entrants in long-distance services and terminal equipment out. A lot of people forget that it was not the FCC that liberalized ordinary mass market switched long-distance services. It was the courts. When MCI sued in the courts to be allowed to use certain connections with Bell telephone companies in order to offer competitive long-distance service. Initially, the FCC declined it, and except for private line services, and it required the courts to overrule the FCC. So what we are asked today in this high-tech era of rapid entry and exit, where the Nokias and the Samsungs trade market positions very quickly, where technology is changing very rapidly, is to believe that somehow bringing government back in through regulation, a la the homely precedent of the Kingsbury Commitment, would be a good thing. I think it's quite to the contrary. In a time of very dynamic technological change, you do not want a lot of government regulation because it is antithetical to allowing new entry, to allowing the development of new services, and to allowing efficient pricing.
All right, thank you, Bob. I'm going to open up some questions for you. This is one for both of you. And this gets to the sort of the aura and the mythology of Kingsbury. This precedent from 100 years ago is frequently cited today by individuals who think that the form of government intervention that you described, Bob, is a good thing and a necessary thing today. And newly confirmed chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, in an online blog a couple of years ago, said AT&T T-Mobile merger was potentially a good thing, and his caption on his headline was something to the effect of, now let's do Kingsbury right, and then he explains, well, this is a great opportunity for the government to impose certain conditions that could be a standard throughout the industry, that you can impose merger conditions in one merger that then could become implicitly enforced throughout the industry. Please give me your reactions to what Chairman Wheeler said at the time, and your views on whether Kingsbury is invoked today. Is Kingsbury still relevant to merger reviews or to other activities where the government looks at private businesses and says, let's make a deal?
Well, whether it's relevant or not, this is what the government does today with merger review or with any antitrust threatened antitrust proceeding. It can threaten to bring a case or actually bring a case and then settle the case with some sort of conditions. The most recent example of this in the at least a large merger would be the American Airlines U.S. Airways merger, which my colleague Cliff Winston said was foolish for the antitrust division to challenge that merger, and it would lose in court because of the facility of JetBlue and Frontier and Southwest for moving planes around if the combination tried to raise prices on certain routes. And eventually the Justice Department backed off and allowed the merger to go through in return for the combined airlines giving up some of their slots, selling some of their slots to competitors. And just recently, I guess Southwest bought a whole bunch of slots at LaGuardia. So this is always possible under the law. The question is, did the Kingsbury Commitment lead to conditions which were beneficial to the development of competition? And the answer is clearly no. And the government turned 180 degrees around by World War I, when we were in it, 1917, 1918, and later with the Willis-Graham Act.
Or earlier in 1914 is in paragraph 4 of Clayton 7. But Harold has a process point which is probably worth talking about, and that's using the occasion of a couple of very desperate merger parties to impose conditions, even if these are never extended to the rest of an industry. If you get a big enough merger in front of you, you can maybe impose conditions that have a large effect on a part of an industry. I can tell you from real-world experience, if you are trying to get a deal done and it's of some size, and maybe you needed DOJ or Federal Trade Commission clearance, and now you need FCC clearance, and maybe you had state clearances, and the deal itself is hard to put together. Often you've got financing, and you've got to keep your key employees from deserting ship. There's real pressure to get the thing closed, and anyone who has the discretion to say, well, I'm not persuaded yet, I think I need to hear more about the public interest. That's a very powerful position to be in, to insist on additional conditions that might not hold up in the normal kind of rulemaking proceeding. From the point of view of the regulator, I completely understand the idea that if there's stuff that you'd like to do that you think would be beneficial to the public interest, you can get some of that imposed on a piece of the industry, why not ask for it and see if it gets volunteered? But the pressure on the companies who are trying to get a merger done to complete their transaction quickly, it's an awkward kind of leverage. I think people who are on the government side of reviewing mergers very quickly come to a position of humility. It does not take long after you've looked at a merger and you've concluded, okay, this is how the world works, and these are the conditions we need if we're going to let it go through, or this is our theory for blocking it. And then a year or two goes by, and the world changes in a way, well, yeah, we didn't expect that. You do become, with a little bit of experience, much more humble about trying to guess the future. I'll just give one example from the FCC, although I got lots of examples from DOJ. Michael Powell, a terrific chair of the Federal Communications Commission, when AOL was buying
Time Warner.
Yeah, that's the best.
AOL was briefly dominant in something my daughter thought was cool called instant messaging. If you wanted to be able to chat quick, this is before text messaging had taken off and before Facebook. Those of you who have a daughter about my daughter's age might know the phenomenon. She had to be on AOL in order to instant message her friends, and it was a dominant little service. And Michael Powell insisted in the FCC insisted as a merger condition of the Time Warner deal that AOL had to open up its instant messaging to rivals. And if they failed to open up, they were deprived of some useful feature. I forget what the useful feature was. I think it was carrying video or some other enhancement of the service. AOL never did open up instant messaging, and now in retrospect, that was a interesting service, but it doesn't have durable market power, and whatever solutions were crafted back then looks silly in retrospect. But over and over, you'll see this with regulators. If Mike Altschul is in the audience, worked on the big case that was before Judge Green. When the AT&T settlement was announced, the government simultaneously abandoned its case against IBM, and there was a thought at the time that maybe IBM was going to be a real rival to AT&T in making telephone equipment. Well, it didn't happen. There was a thought that maybe satellite communications were going to be important ways to carry long-distance calls, and that didn't happen. I mean, there's a as you all know, it's hard to predict the future, and that's one reason to be very cautious in imposing conditions that are going to last more than a little while.
I got another example. That doesn't take a high-tech industry. They're flying in here from New England yesterday. I flew over Baltimore Harbor, which is where the Sparrows Point steel plant is. And fairly recently, I'd have to go back and look it up, when ArcelorMittal bought Bethlehem, one of the conditions, almost post hoc, was that ArcelorMittal spin off the Sparrows Point plant for competitive reasons. When they tried to, they could hardly find a buyer. It was only nickels and dimes were paid for it, and by the way, today the plant is closed. It was an obsolete asset to the government, and this is not in a high-tech industry. But I'd also like to point out that there's a difference between these negotiations with antitrust authorities and with the FCC, because the FCC's domain with the public interest standard is it can run very far afield, and a lot of the deals they cut for their political client base have nothing to do with competition.
Yeah, it's important to understand the procedural difference. The FCC, there's no actual deadline. They do have a clock which they can start or stop at whim, but there's no deadline for FCC action. And so if the FCC fails to act on a merger application, your remedy is probably the D.C. Circuit or some of the Court of Appeals in a mandamus petition, which is very hard to win. DOJ, if you substantially comply with document requests, there's a clock. And if DOJ fails to bring a lawsuit, fails to win an injunction to stop the closing of the deal, you can close.
John, I agree with everything you said except for I'm not sure I would agree with the universality of the humility that regulators learn over time. I think Michael Powell was a great regulator and did learn. I'm not sure that a lot of his colleagues over time acquired humility. And speaking of which, one of the things about Kingsbury is the transparency of process that today just looks both refreshing and naive. You have Kingsbury writing a letter to then Attorney General McReynolds saying, well, Attorney General McReynolds, as you dictated to me over the past 60 days, here are the terms that we're going to offer. And then there's a letter from President Wilson to Attorney General McReynolds, which is just astounding to read. And there's one or two sentences in there that say something to the effect of, well, I'm glad our guys are getting in line, and they're recognizing, they're responding to the influences of competition. They're not responding to the influences of competition. They're responding to the influences of government. And I just wonder if you two could comment about the differences in transparency. Oh, and then AT&T publishes these letters in their annual reports. This wasn't some state secret, whereas today, I think if there were letters exchanged like this, it would be they certainly wouldn't be published in an annual report. This would all be hush-hush. Go ahead.
Get John to respond, but there's a Tunney Act, which requires that these things be approved in a court of law, right?
So at the Justice Department, if you negotiate a consent decree to solve a merger concern, your proposed consent decree has to go to a federal district judge. You're not allowed to, you are allowed to close your deal in the meantime. So you're not required to wait to close for the district court approval. But if a federal judge applies sunshine and the Justice Department files the proposed consent decree, asks the public for comment, so people who had concerns about the merger can file public comments. The district judge can give you a very hard time. I've experienced that personally in asking you questions about your transaction. And the district court has some power. It's not a pure rubber stamp to require changes to the consent decree. But there is no bar to close in the meantime, which is helpful to the private parties. Now, at the FCC, they have a lot of sunshine, and we could have a debate on whether it's really transparent or only partially transparent. But
it's a cloudy day most days.
But merger commitments that are offered by the parties to satisfy FCC staff concerns are put out for public comment, and there's a form of transparency even at the FCC.
By the way, there was a piece in, I think, the Wall Street Journal just the other day about the American U.S. Airways merger. Hasn't gone through the final Tunney Act approval in the courts. I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Judge Emmett Sullivan in the federal district court here in Washington asked me why we had renamed the MCI Center the Verizon Center before he approved the consent decree. That was he found that disconcerting. We'd close the deal, Your Honor.
Why don't we open it up to the audience for some questions? And again, the online, go to Twitter, and is it at Hudson Institute? I keep forgetting the exact frame. Okay. And please identify yourself when asking questions, and I'm going to ask a few more as we go through as well. Any volunteers? Yes, right up here in the front. No, please.
And this is not a question about the Kingsbury Commitment, which was new to me. But I remember when AT&T was broken up, and I was impressed with the decline in phone service that resulted from that breakup. And I would appreciate any comments on that, because it always struck me that Ma Bell, which I grew up with, was a model of a regulated monopoly, and it somehow was much better than what the results were.
Bob, do you know the answer to that? Was your perception that there was an actual decline, and if so, what were its features?
No, I never attempted to look into the question of the quality of service to the final consumer. What I did look into was what it must have cost, given the numbers coming out from the companies, to go through that process. And I wrote a book about it back, I can't even remember the date now, after the breakup is the name of the book. And it was...
You studied something that I think bears on this that's very important, which is the Bell system had kept local telephone service low-priced and high quality by overcharging business customers for long-distance calls.
Or all customers for long-distance calls. The fact is, the complaint that they had monopolized long distance and distorted prices could have been handled just by an FCC regulation. FCC had a couple of investigations just prior to the bringing of the 1974 antitrust case. Had the FCC acted appropriately in interconnection decisions at the time, the whole thing would have been moot. But anyway, the thing I was going to say was what I did discover was that there was about $2 or $3 billion missing that must have gone into just the cost of restructuring all these companies. It was an extremely expensive endeavor. I mean, I guess today we don't think of $2 or $3 billion as a lot of money, but at the time it seemed like a lot of money. Now, as to the quality of the service itself, I don't remember were there more dropped calls and more delays and that sort of thing. I just simply don't remember the quality problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there was. And I finished it in both the original Bell and New York. So
The one
you were a New York customer.
Yeah.
'82 was the consent decree, and '84 was the implementation of the breakup. So
Yeah.
But
spent time in both jurisdictions before they merged, and prices were higher and service was less.
Well, the price of local service would go down. The price of long-distance service would not have been going up. But what did happen as a result of the breakup was that the subsidies from long-distance service to local service became much more explicit. There were subscriber line charges. So if you go to the back page of your bill, and if you could possibly understand it, that'll tell you how the government is making it more transparent. You may not think that's transparent, but there are a lot of numbers there.
Let me.
Question back there.
I just want to respond in three ways as well. First of all, a lot of the quality of service issues are actually handled at the state rather than the federal level, particularly in terms of local service. So if you had problems in New York, it really was much more of a New York PSC issue than an FCC issue. I would say one of my first private sector studies was of changes in total factor productivity for the Bell system before and after the breakup. And this was before I was a very clever consultant. And I consistently found, in fact, that in the years from 84 through 87, that the Bell system actually was less efficient than it had been historically. And I think a lot of that probably just related to just the extraordinary changes that were going on, and probably just a lot of organizations that were being reshuffled and had not quite hit full stride. But I think your question actually brings into focus some of the exact problems that were created by Kingsbury. If you look at the 1982 consent decree, which was done by really arguably some of the brightest antitrust folks in America at the time. This was hailed, and I think in history is looked at as one of the great antitrust settlements of all time. And yet there were a lot of extraordinarily detailed decisions that were made that proved to be exactly wrong. And one of the greatest things that was exactly wrong was the Judge Green court that just became this bottleneck for anything going on in the industry. So there was a court appointed that was to resolve all kinds of disputes, and that system just really did not work. I don't know how much of that resulted in the service quality problems that you describe after the breakup, but I think that practically all observers of the industry, both inside and outside of the Bell system, would agree that there were serious problems, traumatic problems going on in the late 80s after the breakup.
I'm sorry, one more anecdote.
Please.
Because John Goodman is in the audience. I think it was about 1987. It was 1989. He and I ran into Judge Green's courtroom because all telephone service in Maryland, Virginia, D.C. had gone out, and we thought we might be able to help the provider of the equipment we were using to fix it. But the Justice Department couldn't tell us that it was okay to work with the manufacturer, because that might, if you got too involved in the manufacturer, you might be a manufacturer, and that was prohibited. So to repair the downed telephone system, we needed Judge Green's permission to work with the manufacturers. That was a whole homely example.
Question in the back.
Yes, my name is Joel Hetker. CAB 1978, 79, I guess, is gone, and then the ICC in 1997. What would you see next as being sunsetted? The Federal Maritime Commission, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or the FCC?
Which would be the next to depart the scene?
Right.
Oh, that's a political question. I don't even live in Washington anymore. I defer to my two friends who still live here.
I have a partner, Peter Huber, who has a book whose subtitle is "Abolish the FCC." Yeah. But I don't think anybody's taken that as a serious suggestion for our lifetimes.
And I would add as a footnote that while the ICC, the name is gone, the agency is still there. It's called the National Transportation Service Board or something. It still regulates the railroads. It's a small shadow of its former self, no doubt, but it did not completely disappear.
The one that is most nakedly protectionist, obviously, would be the Federal Maritime Commission. And probably the most dangerous one to try to get rid of would be that one. My recollection is from former friends who took a run at that. They feared for their lives.
Question: what is the future of government negotiations with private companies look like? How has it changed? Is it the same today? Maybe, John, you particularly could offer an opinion about this. When a private company has a high-stakes negotiation with the federal government, is it the same today as it was in the past, and is it likely to be the same in the future? And particularly, you're dealing outside of the realm of statute. You're dealing outside of the realm of just ordinary regulation. You're negotiating something that has a sort of an ad hoc process to it, largely outside of the view of the public, largely outside of the view of all the other branches of government. And how has that changed over time?
Let me speak to the Justice Department rather than the FCC.
Yes.
If that's okay. And then, Bob, you want to say something about the other agencies? The professional staff at the Department of Justice has been doing merger reviews long enough, has seen enough of these things, that they've actually gotten very good with the private parties of setting expectations, at saying right up front, this is a problem, this isn't a problem, or we need to think, because you've just identified 136 markets, and we have to figure out which of these are problems and which aren't, and so we need to sort them, and here's the process we're going to go through, and here's what we need your help to do. The government has gotten good at anticipating what an efficient review would look like, and practitioners who are getting better are also good at going into the government and saying, okay, we're not just going to give you a happy talk that everything is fine and this is a dandy merger. We actually think you've got one or two concerns that you're going to need to scrub, and here's the first tranche of documents that's going to address those concerns. Well, on both sides, I think the process has gotten better, and I would expect it to continue getting better, so that there should be fewer surprises. I can list some recent counterexamples where the merger parties say they were surprised, and that surprises me.
The Justice Department and the FTC, though, they have to go to court to block something from happening. They can't just sit on it, as you said. They actually have to actively do something, and that probably raises the standard of oversight. Whereas that's true. But there's also continuity, I think, of the professional staff and experience that is built up and institutionalized. Even with turnover in the people, they get better at dealing with mergers. The FCC, my impression, I don't deal with them as much, is that the political turnover makes it harder to be as consistent and to build the experience that would be useful.
Yeah, and well, in my experience, there have been times and things I've actually worked on where there was intervention from the White House to offset the expert views of the agencies, but it was relatively rare. It's a pretty clean process compared to others. I mean, I think you're talking about just the general relationship between firms contracting with government and so forth. I think the most interesting evolution of that's going to happen in the next few months with national health insurers. I mean, it appears now that the government's going to tell these national health insurers that they should honor contracts that don't exist, because these contracts cannot be consummated on healthcare.gov, and therefore we're going to go into January with people thinking they have health insurance but not having finished it. And I mean, there are all sorts of things in that healthcare law. Apparently, there were something called corridor payments or something to the health insurance companies if, in fact, they lose money in this process. It's going to be an interesting negotiation process between a big private industry and the government.
At least there's some transparency, because you have high-ranking administration officials telling the whole world that this is going to happen. Maybe the insurance carriers don't know about it.
Not identifying themselves.
Other questions from our audience? If not, let's give a round of applause to our speakers today.